Okay, hello, hello, hello to everybody listening and watching us out there. Welcome to Melanin and Moonlight. I'm one of your co-hosts, Tyrell Collins.
I'm the other Vernon Scott, and welcome everybody. It's been a while. I am to blame for that.
It's
Life
always
changes,
either one of us.
right? Look, sometimes when life just brings you things, you just gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah,
Transitions and all that other stuff. But happy to be where we are. How are
absolutely.
you? How was
Doing
your break?
doing well. I'm up here wrapping up, summer session. As everybody knows, I'm pretty much an educator, so just they know how, how it feels when you get on that cusp of okay, I'm ending, but it's like, oh shit, now I gotta start all over. I gotta start all over again. It's like, no.
Yes,
But it's
yes.
okay. I get a few weeks, to myself where it's like I don't have to go nowhere. So I like that aspect.
I feel you there. We were on break, but I didn't really get to enjoy my break as much because of life things. But I'm happy to be back into the groove of things. Like today was the first day in a while I actually did some of my advising stuff, so I was like, "Yay, got to
Yeah.
do that." So things are starting to feel a little bit normal. Complete side note, you, you um, feel like this has been one of the best investments that I've go ahead and try to get one of those for myself.
Mhm.
A wonderful investment because like when I tell you it's just always cold, yes, I could have it in the refrigerator, but it's kind of like if I'm lazy and I'm in my office because I keep it here in my office, I don't have to worry about going anywhere. I just go, Give me some water." It's great.
All
Oh,
good. It's all good.
wonderful investment.
It's all good. Yes. Yes. Oh, but yeah, so excited to, kind of delve in for today with some of the things that, we're talking about, things that are ongoing and, deeply tragic. And again, as far as just thinking about a lot of conversations that can stem from a lot of these topics that we'll tackle for today. I'm hoping that it gives some reprieve, some solace, and just some good kind of questions for us to continue to think about. And one of the first things we wanted to discuss for today was the tragedy, of course, surrounding Nolan Wells, a young 18-year-old, young man who unfortunately lost his life, in the nature of a trip incident that, some other people, other, quote unquote friends were involved in. And so, just really framing it around just, obviously, first and foremost, condolences to, the Wells family and, losing him under circumstances that are continuous and, obviously ongoing with an investigation that kind of remain unclear while feeling that, you still don't, of course, have the complete account about what happened in his final hours. It's such, grief that, is unpacked. And so, again, obviously, obviously everybody has their speculations to, what happened, and things like that. And again, we're not here to, speculate or, put false rhetoric out there. Again, we can't, manufacture, facts or anything like that. But I think that, a case like this has opened a very painful conversation about how, particularly for Black parents, how do you prepare your children to enter predominantly white friendships and environments and still try to lead with love, try to teach your children to lead with love and compassion, even though that's not how the world will, you know, get, a lot of times how the world will not give back to you. And it's not just, the nature of, in white spaces, but just, again, thinking about the nature of Nolan's passing, of Nolan's death, the mysterious circumstances surrounding it, clear signs of something, is a cover up and, things like that. And this is not something that, of course, is new, especially as, this, took place in Mississippi's Horn Island, and Mississippi has a very long, history and trajectory of covering up, especially death surrounding Black people. So, again, it's just such a tragic thing, but so many, I think, conversations have stemmed, from the nature of this tragedy. So, just what are your initial thoughts about the nature of no, obviously this Nolan Wells, kind of situation, and what conversations have you seen, kind of sprout from it?
Um, it's a reminder, an unfortunate reminder that Black people in this country are still fighting to just be considered human, where we can, our pain has a choice. Well, people are actively choose not to engage and see the pain that we feel.
Mm,
Because in any other case, this is a family who lost a child.
mm,
This is sad. This is a situation where we don't know what happened, and we can jump to as many conclusions as possible, but we're not jumping to the idea that, oh, this it happens to just be a suicide, right? We're not just jumping to it having to be just murder because, a lot of people are sitting on waiting on the facts, but we do recognize that there are racial components that do
mm,
impact sense of safety, right? Yes, it will be beautiful for us to have a world where a Black who has white friends are the only person in the group, right? That your safety will be considered regardless. I'm glitching. Oh no! Wait, can you hear me?
mm, I hear
Okay, all right. So connections are acting up. I need to get me an Ethernet. Yeah, I'm sorry, y'all. I just moved here. But anyways, um, um,
you.
it's a tragedy that we even have to have these conversations because it should be okay for a kid to just be comfortable with the people who they consider classmates, that they consider friends, regardless of what their racial dynamic happens to be, to know that if something were to go awry, that people will see his humanity to notify people rather than try to cover it up, right? Let's say if there happened to be something that was completely innocent, right?
Mm,
That the family would not have been approached with lies, but would have been approached with empathy and recognition of there's a pain and it's an unfortunate truth that I now have to share. But
mm,
that's not what they received. What they received was hushed mouths, um, sense or air of conspiracy, cover up, lies. How am I supposed to rest with what you tell me has to be truth
mm.
when you did not come to this situation with, honesty, that
Right.
you were not forthcoming with what's happening. We're lowering up before you even acknowledge the pain that a mother and father may be experiencing,
Yes.
right? You're lowering up before there's even someone thinking about the need of suing. You're
Mm,
lowering up before the parents are even notified of what happened to their own child before there was even a body found. It's just
Mhm.
suspicion that a person is missing, and we're already preparing for the aftermath of that.
Yeah. And, and I think it's, when this story first broke, I immediately thought, okay, it's not, a responsible position to say, okay, Nolan was murdered because he was black. Even though obviously we know that that happens. Of course it happens.
Hmm.
But again, we're following the logical train of, events, timeline, and sequence. So right now there is no current public evidence that proves that. However, what is equally irresponsible is authorities initially saying that they did not suspect foul play, so everybody should stop asking questions. It's like, what? It's kind of like, how are you not suspecting foul play when you haven't even investigated? Like, that is very inappropriate to, to even put out there, right? This young man went to an island with other people. Those people returned with some of his belongings, and he did not. Right. So his parents have every right to ask what happened, why was he left there, what condition he was in when the others departed, what everyone knew, and whether every account and piece of digital evidence has been thoroughly examined.
Hmm.
And so, and then again, when we look at the optics of this particular case and situation, right, we can see why the investigation of Nolan looks the way it does. He is the only black person that is pictured in a photo with three white young men. And now, again, the optics of that is okay, let's do the obvious reversal. If it was three black men, young black men, and somebody who was murdered was a, young white man, oh, this case would be handled entirely differently.
Hmm.
There wouldn't even be no questioning or suspicion. If you are in a group and you are three young black men and a white boy and a young white man goes missing, oh, y'all going to jail. Oh, you just immediately finna be arrested.
And even with that, like one definitely they're being locked up without any type of investigation.
Exactly.
Like we're jumping to conclusion and saying no foul play whenever it's three white boys, one black person, it's everybody's arrested and this has to be murder and nothing but foul play if it's three black boys, one white boy. But
Mm,
the thing is just thinking about what that dynamic would be if it were just all white boys, right? How in that situation, I imagine it being a little bit of space of one, we don't know what happened here. We're still investigating the situation. We cannot rule out foul play as of yet.
mm,
The kids, they are with their families until further notice, and they will have a little bit of leeway until law enforcement figure out what happened before they even see
mm.
behind a bar. They
Right.
will give a little bit of grace or innocence towards those white boys when the one white boy is dead, right?
Mm,
The family will be given empathy. They will be given understanding and assurance that we'll be doing everything possible to see what happened to your child, while also be willing to hold the others accountable if they so happen to, if there's some type of inkling of foul play being,
exactly.
somewhere. And also to take in consideration, because it is different if the dynamic happens to be three poor white boys and one white boy who's wealthy versus all of them wealthy, right? So
Yes.
it's like, and it sucks that we even have to do those hypothetical scenarios because at the end of the day, whatever the scenario happens to be, we deserve a law enforcement, we deserve a legal system that is willing to give that empathy to all people regardless, that we're willing to take things slow and also be willing to hold the parties accountable if there's a need, that we will actually look at the evidence, determine whether or not there's actual foul play, and move forward accordingly. regardless of what this person's race happens to be. But unfortunately, that's not the legal system that we have, and it's irritating that people continue to act as though that the legal system operates outside of the way that it is. It's
Exactly.
annoying that here we are in 2026 and we have the same people making the similar arguments about um, how the what police don't lie
Hmm.
as though they're known for telling the truth. Like, what?
Yeah, so again, and that is a distorted schism. Like it's like, okay, if you want to believe that the police don't lie, but that's something to believe, but they damn for sure don't tell the truth too. So it's like, again, if you can hold space for one truth, let's hold the space for the other one too.
Hmm.
So yeah, and like I say, I think again, just so many conversations that have been, again, sprouted from the nature of this incident. And one that I was running across again online was obviously because of the fact Nolan, of course, is so young, being 18 years old. Parents having a lot of times conversations about, you try to teach, especially for Black parents, you try to teach your child to love everyone, obviously respect everyone, those kind of things. But again, are you doing a disservice to them when you know that the world doesn't treat them like that? And I have very strong feelings about the nature of that conversation because I think teaching children that race does not determine a person's worth is morally right. And we see that with children. The reason why we protect children so much in society is because children are literally the most innocent of beings. Children do not grow up. Children do not, especially as we say, don't see, color and don't see race. Children literally don't. Like they have curiosity and have questions, but they don't obviously understand the nuances, right, of somebody's, ethnicity, color, race, and things like that. So, but I think the mistake occurs when that lesson becomes race will never affect how others see you. Everyone enter, people can think that, okay, we enter friendships on equal, social footing, or that kindness automatically is gonna guarantee how you talked about earlier, like that safety, right? And I think, as far as raising Black children, I think we have to have conversation where we have a open heart and discussion about both ends of that spectrum. And so I think that the greater lesson here is that yes, people of every race are capable of loving you, and people of every race are capable of harming you. But because you are Black, there are particular histories, stereotypes, institutions, and group dynamics that may shape how people treat you. And so, in
Hmm.
talking to children, I think that you can tell them that I want you to love without hating, but to also observe and question and set boundaries and leave, environments when you feel that you're not respected. And even as I think about research, I mean, research on racial socialization genuinely distinguishes, right, between these aspects of like cultural pride and preparation for bias and, just all these type of things. And I think in preparing Black children to recognize and respond to discrimination can, of course, support healthier coping, particularly when that is paired with this kind of cultural affirmation that, we tend to talk about rather than teaching children solely through fear. So I've often always believed like teaching only mistrust doesn't necessarily produce the same protective benefits. You should never teach from a place of fear, even though it scares you out of your mind. Of course, it's scary,
Hmm.
but it's not that that's what you should lead with. Yeah.
Exactly. And I agree 100%. And, in terms of some of the conversations that I've been seeing online, which one that I don't agree with is the people who took it upon themselves to blame the parents for, Nolan's situation, which does not make any sense. His
Right.
parents did not send him away on that trip expecting for their child to die,
Right.
right?
That is a
They did not set him up for failure in any sense, right? Because regardless of who Nolan happens to be around, was deserving of safety, right?
Mhm.
Just point blank, period. And people because some of the conversations that I was seeing, and this is within the early stages, I think within a couple of days when people were showing who he was hanging out with, having those conversations like, oh, my mama would have never had me here, and all these other things are, I was always taught not to be the only one, which I get many of us had that conversation, right? But even with that, it doesn't mean that Nolan's parents didn't have that conversation with him. It's not to mean that they were not wary of the situation. And we also don't know what the dynamics look like when it comes to Nolan's family and those friends, because it's possible that they were very much so comfortable because of what was displayed prior
Mhm.
to any incidents happening, right? Because what we all know that when it comes to certain people, we may show up with a mask on, or we may show up with a different identity than we may show up in other spaces. So who knows how these kids may have presented themselves as being genuine friends to Nolan and
Mhm.
also being willing to do harm to Nolan at the same time,
Mhm.
right? We don't know what internal machinations are going on for people in their private lives.
Mhm.
So to put fault onto his parents is not helping in this situation at all.
Right.
It is putting more pressure and weight on a family who's trying to grieve and
Mhm.
now having to grieve public because their experience became more national news, right?
Right.
And we don't think about oftentimes because we've got grown to become accustomed of giving our 2 cents, our little think pieces on all things that we don't really think about how does this statement impact this family, right?
Right.
Even if this is the thing that you want to highlight, you know, there's a way that we can communicate and say and be genuine in saying, I feel for Nolan's parents because he did not deserve anything. I
Mhm.
remember being in a place where my parents had the conversations with me about not being the only person. And I hate that Nolan being with a group of his considered friends that he went missing,
Mhm.
right? I can empathize with what is happening, share concern for the parents, while also sharing my own experiences without adding shame on his family as they're trying to understand what is happening in their lives. Like
Mhm.
they went a full 24 hours not knowing where their son was, just to find out their son has passed away. And
Exactly.
now, after that, they've had a funeral for their child and still don't even know how he even died.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and it's just it's again like you just said, it's so sad that we have to have these conversations, or we can see where the letters of the law are just unjust, and even for other conversations that were springing up that I was seeing about, I think from both a black and white perspective, that again, as we did when situations like this happen, it's like, okay, talking about diversity, right? And so the whole thing about diversity being valuable, yes, but again, just as you mentioned earlier, diversity is also something that does not automatically, make something safe. And so for our black people that are listening to us, or multi-ethnic people that are listening to us, feel like sometimes putting your child in a more diverse environment or a different environment automatically protects them. It does not. For
Hmm.
you for predominantly white people, thinking that, oh, okay, just because my child may have black friends, so they can't be racist. No, that's not how that works. That's not how that works. None of those conclusions automatically are going to guarantee safety or a progressive establishment of diversity, and particularly when it comes to dealing, I think, with any type of family, but particularly when it comes to, again, families that are white. It is not just about are there, white children around, like my black child. It is, coming from a, black perspective, it's kind of like what have those children been taught, right,
Mm,
about race, about consent, about accountability, and things like that. And so, I think for, anybody that, is white, you have a responsibility, right? You can't merely instruct your children to treat everybody the same. You have to teach them how racism actually operates. But then that also stems from you trying to become more educated as well. And that's what I have always just this pushback against. People always want to say, well, how can somebody learn, do better if they didn't learn? But a great opportunity is if you don't know, guess what? There are a million resources that are out here that you can have to educate yourself. We live in such a digital world, technology. Even if you're not tech savvy, you can actually go in person to get to get educated. It's like you don't have, to me, it's like you don't have the excuse not to know. You're making
mhm,
excuses because either you don't want to know or you don't want to be put in positions and conversations that make you feel uncomfortable.
mhm,
And we tend to talk about that with enslavement or any other type of oppression. It's kind of like, if you feeling guilty, why are you feeling guilty? You ain't did nothing. You didn't, like, you ain't did nothing. So it's like, again, these conversations are hard to have, but they're necessary to have if you actually want to do better. And
mhm,
you can't continue to have these abstract statements about equality that undermine when discussions of racism or these failed anti-racist models do not mirror what you do in everyday practice.
mhm,
So it's just like you can't have that you can't have that excuse. And also for any of obviously our younger people that's listening to us, and again, it's a conversation for everybody, but particularly for younger people, I think that when it comes to situations where you are the minority amongst, of course, a friend group, I think that cases like this, where as a young Black person, you may feel pressure not to appear to be difficult or angry or overly sensitive or unable to take a joke, that pressure can cause you to remain in situations where your instincts are telling you that something is wrong. And I think that a good lesson to take away, not just for younger people, but again, really thinking about parents here, is you need to know that you always have permission to leave, to call home, to reject somebody telling a joke at your expense, to demand space, to disrupt, any type of discomfort. And I think that that's a thing that I think a lot of young people, face. You don't want to be that one, that brings something up
mm,
uncomfortable, or it's like, oh, well, like, hey, that person was just joking, or, whatever. Like, so you try to, let things slide. Because again, and I can understand that aspect. It's kind of like, and not everything you feel like needs to be World War III. But if it continues to happen, or you are surrounding yourself with people that allow it to happen, and either one, they do not correct themselves, apologize, take accountability, or they don't stop, maybe you need to have some different friend groups.
mhm. Yeah.
You know.
And I'm gonna jump into that one in a little second too, but going back to the, willingness to be uncomfortable, I want to challenge people to be more honest with themselves too,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? If you know that you're not going to do the work, if you know that you're uncomfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, then just be truthful with that, with that. Let people know. you know what? This is something that I have the capabilities of understanding, but I'm actively choosing not to understand it.
Right.
I'm actively choosing not to engage in it because I don't want to make myself uncomfortable.
Mm,
And I encourage you to sit in that, right?
yeah.
What is it that is making you comfortable with this idea of not engaging, right? What is it that is helping you feel comfortable enough to not be uncomfortable, right? When this happens to be the reality that many other people face, right? Where they have to consistently be uncomfortable,
Mm,
right? Learning about Black history has never been comfortable for Black people,
mhm,
right? And to feel uncomfortable as someone who's non-Black, okay, great. Welcome to the club. Continue to
mhm,
sit in that, right? Because we still have to, as we as in Black people, engage with that regardless of whether or not you're willing to do that work. We're
mhm.
still impacted by it,
Right.
right? And then the other thing is a reminder that crime is proximity, right? Whoever we surround ourselves with. So if I'm in a black community, I live in a black community, then if crime happens, it's more than likely going to be somebody that's black. If I live in a white community, the crime is going to be more than likely somebody white. If you live in Asian, it does not matter necessarily who you surround yourself with. If crime is going to happen, crime
Mm,
is going to be because of the proximity that you're in. And I say that because all these things are human. All these things are within us. The same, whoever, if it happens to be murder, whoever it was who caused that murder, that's not a characteristic that's only isolated to them because of their race or identity. It's something that's just happened to be within them, right?
mhm,
There, and that is true regardless of where you are. It happens to be this kid here. It happened to be another kid in a different place and another kid here, blah, 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 blah.
mm,
An adult who's willing to do these harms to other people,
right.
right? That is something that just exists in nature, right?
Mm,
Now, the other thing is that we do, especially young people, have to be wary about choosing better friends. It is important for us to really do that. If somebody is not treating you with kindness and the respect that you see for yourself, it is okay. Like you said, Tyrell, it is okay for you to leave that situation. It is okay for you not to be friends with those people, even if that means a loss of social capital.
mm,
Social capital is not worth your integrity. Social capital is not worth your life. Social capital is not worth you being miserable.
mhm. Yeah.
Choose people that pour more into you than others who may have in the past or the lack thereof. By
Exactly.
choosing better friends, we're able to engage in a lot more of these safe experiences. Like, again, not to, just put this all on Nolan's friends or just white people in general, but in order for us to occupy spaces where we feel completely safe, like I have three, I think, white friends. Maybe more. I don't know. I can count on one hand, and it's not on purpose. But if I happen to be out in public or out on an island with those three, they've shown themselves in the past to be willing to defend Black people even when Black people are not in the room. So if I know something, if something were to happen to me, at least they will be there to support whatever search is needed to make sure I'm taken care of. If I'm
Right.
out with those three, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And again, not to say anything about necessarily that dynamic for Nolan Wells, but in general, with my black friends, same thing. They're going to vouch and make sure we find out what happened to Vernon. My
Mhm.
Asian friends, which is a little bit more few, I don't know how, I don't know why, but the same thing. It was proximity, I know why, but the same thing happens ensuring
Mhm.
that you find or connect with people who see your true humanity I will encourage people, regardless of their age, to continue that path as they build relationships. It's
Exactly.
important.
Exactly. And yeah, and to wrap and to wrap this up, it's again, just as you say, this is not about, because I've seen this in comments as well, it's like, okay, talking about the race component of this is like, oh my God, like let's demonize white people, let's, reject white people and everything like that. And it's like, no, the idea is not to reject this notion that every, white friendship is inherently dangerous. No, again, we do we need to have conversations? Yes, but it is not to the answer is not to teach your black children hatred or total mistrust. The answer is to teach them love, to love with open eyes. And just as you said, I don't care what race, creed, or color you are. At the end of the day, if I am with you, I want to know that we have each other's best interests at heart. you know and so I think that while the Wells family waits for answers, our obligation is to, of course, demand a transparent investigation without converting, rumors into, like guilt, of course. And I think that we can honor the racial history that makes a case like this and so many others in the past frightening while remaining honest about what has and has not yet been proven.
Hmm.
So I think that, again, this is probably something obviously we will, be coming back to as, developments, continue to be underway. But again, for now and moving, forward, just continued prayers and thoughts for, the Wells family for sure.
Indeed, indeed.
And and yeah, so something else that has made we gonna need some true thoughts and prayers for is this dress code debacle that has happened with the nature of Tuskegee um, Institute University. And yeah, it has become a very decisive conversation, online. So if you do not know, just a little bit of, context of the aspect of the president, essentially for Tuskegee, has they are trying to update the nature of what's already in obviously in their handbooks about the dress code. So, just giving context, the president's letter says that students should arrive Tuskegee with a business suit and appropriate, shoes available for professional meetings. Case in point, professional meetings. It separately prohibits revealing clothing in classrooms, the cafeteria, and official settings like convocation, and prohibiting like bedroom shoes and bonnets and do rags in classrooms, and things like that. And so the announcement kind of included the whole nature of like the cell phone thing, which hasn't actually really been talked about as much. A lot of conversation has strictly pretty much just been on the clothing. Now for me, I am I have a firm, kind of belief in standing with this, but I also believe that both ends of the conversation have, again, just like how we talk about the internet, have been gotten way out of hand with the statements and things like that. So I do just want to preface in saying, just as a graduate of a HBCU, I actually do support I do support the nature of the dress code. Not just because I believe that, I do not believe it's trying to police the things that, students wear and, things like that. But I do think that over the years, we have gotten a little bit too laxed in the way that I think institutions are trying to prepare students to appear in the world professionally. And again, I will say, again, some people are not reading the aspects of the letter. The letter is not saying that we expect students to show up to class every day in three-piece business suits and, things like that. It's not to say that you need to come to class professionally dressed every day. It is the simple fact of making sure that items that have traditionally been known to be sleepwear like pajamas, like do rags and bonnets, and other those other clothing items that that remains in the confines of your home, your dormitory, or anything like that at the time. Because when you step into a classroom, you are now in a professional setting. But again, we'll get into the weeds of it, but let me know essentially your initial thoughts when this came out.
So I'm on the side of I do see this as being rooted in anti-Blackness as well as policing Black bodies.
Right.
And part of that is because one is in what ways does these rules change how these students show up in the classroom? Right? As well as in because if from my take on it is that this is also extending in other public spaces as well that's on campus. I get, in terms of if I'm meeting with the campus president and whatnot, I want there to be a certain dress code and we respect that. As well as convocation for the students who are graduating, for them to have a, certain dress code because, you know, there it makes sense, right? However, the when I maneuver around campus, I should have that freedom to show up however I choose to show up in a way that is not causing any undue discomfort on another person. Meaning, if I do want to come to class in a crop top and booty shorts, I have that right to do so. Um, if it caused somebody else some kind of issues, I am covered up, right? I am wearing something that I would wear in the general public or what have you. Now, not to say that there won't be any discomfort by that. Of course, people have issues with seeing plus size bodies, but it is what it is. But whatever. But the reason I bring it up is because I remember my time in undergrad where one even my professors came to class. If they just left the gym and they came to the class right after that, there was no issue, right? Everybody was comfortable in how we showed up because at the end of the day, we're here to learn, and that is the mission. And I get if Tuskegee wanted to ensure that the professionals showed up in these spaces in a certain way. Great. However, that does not necessarily mean that the students have to do the same thing because I think about that concept of college being a thing that prepares people for life. Yes. Well, adulthood, but I think about how I show up as an adult today. If I have to go to the Security office, I don't have to go to the Social Security office in a suit and tie. I don't have to go there in jeans. I can go there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, and I still receive the services that I need, which means I don't have to show up to financial aid the same way. And for many students, this is their home. I'm living on campus, therefore I get to occupy the public spaces as the extension of my home, the extension of my dorm room, because many of those don't have kitchens. So if I do go to the cafeteria and I go to the cafeteria in slippers, I will show up in my home kitchen the same way. I'm here for my food. I'm hoping the food is good, and after I leave, I'm good. If I go to a public restaurant today, I can go to a public restaurant in my slippers, get me some food to go, and go home, right? And that's not a problem. I get some restaurants do have their own dress codes, and that's fine. When I see that, hey, this is not a restaurant for me because that dress code doesn't fit me, right? And especially if it happens to be I need to wear a suit and tie. A suit and tie makes me uncomfortable, right? And it's always made me uncomfortable. I hate wearing slacks. Working in corporate was frustrating for me for the fact that I had to wear slacks and sometimes a button up. So I found a different job, yes, right? Like even what I do today, I can show up in very loose clothing and feel comfortable. I could wear a dry fit shirt, but again, this is the profession I'm in. It's not everybody's, right? And I think the error in this rule is that we are not even thinking about in what professions are we really preparing the students for, because each profession has a different requirement of what they deem as professional at the same time.
Right.
So okay, I'm of that mindset that I will literally walk into a classroom, leave a suit and tie, and
Mm.
then walk out and ask it to take my test for me because you said that's how I'm supposed to show up. And if I don't pass, that's not on me. You said I had to show up in that. I left that there. Now, me physically being there and whatever I'm wearing now, I could take that test. Is that going to change the scoring of or the performance of the school? If there's a classroom full of suits, oh, everybody's failing. But if I come up in there in my PJs and I take that test, at least we got scores coming through. Right. So that's my mindset when it comes to that. And I don't think the administration really thought about how this rule really plays out necessarily in real world settings. It gives more of controlling the atmosphere, which is the purpose of dress codes in general. But we're controlling the atmosphere versus just like we're going after a problem that may not be a problem. In certain classrooms, if I say, hey, this is how you're going to show up in my class, okay, great. I know that for this semester, but next semester, if I can avoid your class, I'm not choosing you,
Mm.
right? If I'm depressed, you cannot tell me how I'm going to show up on that day. I'm just being real. If
Mm.
I do not have it in me to put on my mask, to show up in a certain way to make another person comfortable, I'm not going to show up. Right? If I cannot be in my most comfortable outfit, especially on the days I'm feeling my lowest, I'm not going to go to that place, which keeps me more isolated than anything. But if I have the option to show up in my depressed uniform, I'm more likely to show up to that space, get the education that I want, and then move forward to the next thing I have to do.
Mm.
So yeah, that's why I think of it in that way.
No, no, definitely, and definitely understanding that perspective. And I think, for me, when I see, the initial conversation, I think that the conclusions, at least from what I was seeing, especially online, is that it's not as as simple as Tuskegee is making everyone dress like corporate execs every day. I
Hmm.
think the closer thing is that it's more like saying like, okay, we are reinforcing a campus wide distinction between what we consider to be dormitory dress, ordinary casual, kind of just however you want to frame that, and attire that is appropriate for academic and professional settings. And so I have two things that I wanted to kind of like just go against the grain against about arguments that, I've kind of seen. One is about the fact of I pay tuition, so I should just be able to wear whatever I want to. To me, that is a kind of skewed argument by itself because as students, you pay tuition to enter an educational community that already has requirements, conduct expectations, policies, rules, resident life policies, all these sorts of things. So paying tuition does not eliminate those standards, right? So you pay tuition, but that does still cannot you cannot use your phone during, like typically use your phone during an examination. You can't
Hmm.
disrupt a lecture. You cannot ignore lab safety rules when it comes to the nature of attire.
Facts.
So tuition purchase you access to an institution's educational opportunities, under under their rules. It doesn't it doesn't mean that, oh, okay, I can just, pretty much do what I want to. So students paying tuition, you do have a right to expect clear rules and fair
Hmm.
enforcement of those rules and to have reasonable accommodations, which is where I am going to eventually get to. I do have a problem with the language that Tuskegee put out, but, just sticking to my point for a minute. So I think that I don't think it's a fair assessment to say from a student's point of view, like, okay, I pay tuition. So again, so there should just be no, dress standard. What I think is a more reasonable kind of window to kind of view it is, okay, I pay tuition. So tell me precisely what the rule is, how it's going to be enforced, who decides what, is being revealed. And, whether violating it will cause me to miss out on my, instructional time. So that's one thing. Also, I've heard this conversation about, well, college is not a job. So if I'm going to classes, so people have brought up, okay, I would never show up in my slippers, pajamas, or a bonnet or a do-rag on my job, on my job. So I've heard, people say, like, okay, well, college is not a job. And so I would like to say to that, technically, that is correct. College is not employment. Students are not employees simply because they attend class. But to me, the whole college is not a job does not mean that being in a collegiate setting has no responsibilities to prepare students for professional environments. Universities and colleges are, you teach disciplinary content, which means that students are being taught how to meet deadlines, how to communicate with authority figures, collaborate with peers, move between formal and informal environments, present themselves publicly, and recognize what different occasions require. So yeah, college should not become, like, again, this 24-hour simulation of a corporate employment. Of course not. Students, you need the freedom to express and, things like that. But again, as we talk about, there's a time and a place, and there's a time and a place for everything. And to me, showing up, and I don't even care if it's an 8 o'clock in the morning class, showing up as like you just rolled out of bed. And now, when I say rolled out of bed, I do not want that to be mistaken of, and I do push back at some people online when they say, like, oh, well, students who come to class with a bonnets and do rags and stuff like that must be unkept and unbathed and all that type of stuff. No, that is taking our that way out of line, way too far. But looking like you are not putting any sort of appropriate pride into your appearance, entering into a setting where you are in collaboration with not only your peers, but also your professors, also taking into account. And I guess the reason why I've always kind of felt strongly about this is because when you are in a classroom or a college setting, you never know who may come, who you may run across or who you may come into contact with. And so, say for instance, this is just an ordinary day for you. You coming into class, with your bonnet, your do rag, your slippers, your pajamas, or whatever. Teacher has invited, somebody who could possibly set you up with an internship or some type of job opportunity. And so, again, it is not to say that your appearance is a blatant aspect about your character. No, it is not. However, the ways in which you do present and show up, they do matter. So the whole thing of, oh, as long as, as long as the student's learning, who cares, about how, we're showing up. And yes, of course, there's value in learning. Of course, we know that. That said, it should not stop the claim that a student in pajamas, that, showing up in your, pajamas and, what we consider to be sleepwear is appropriate. So,
Hmm.
you know. But again,
And
like I say, I have problems with the nature of the language that was put out, which we'll get to that in a second. But I'm sorry, you
mm,
just continue.
no, and I agree with everything that you said with pushback. Let's put it that way. So
Yeah.
like for me, like let's go with the last, with the, you don't know who's going to be there. I feel like some of that does come from the respectability, or respectability politics in general, which yes, we don't know if there's going to be somebody that has an opportunity. However, if my attire takes away from my work, then that just means that you are not a person that will see the value of my work already, right? Because you're putting an image above what I produce, right? Which means I may have to put on an image of myself every time I go into work for you. And that may in and of itself create a unhealthy balance for somebody as time go on. Or I might start to engage with my own imposter at one point because I've been so focused on putting on this mask to be in this space that I forget that my work actually does have value, right? So I think, yes, there is some truth that you don't know, but at the same time, is my professor bringing people in that's actually going to value me for what I do? Right? And I think that's the other aspect that we don't really engage when we come up with that, scenario.
Yeah.
And I agree, college is not a job. But I do think, yes, there is that preparedness, like you said, um, understanding scheduling, meeting deadlines, all that does come within the realms of the collegiate environment, but we also have career services for a reason. We can restructure how we utilize that. Like my best friend, she actually suggested something that was because we were having this conversation. She
Mhm.
suggested something that I didn't even think about, and she used to work in career services too. But with the first year classes, if we really want to help students gain that, utilize that in having more engaged conversations about what professionalism looks like in different workspaces, as well as how to do an email, all the things that you would need to be a better professional, but that's only relegated to that particular department or that particular class. And it can even be a series that go throughout your collegiate environment where, hey, a part of this class, because I know a lot of business classes do it as well, a part of this class is to show up this way in this suit, or when we do presentations, that day is when you have to come prepared in this way, right?
Mhm.
It's a part of the assignment, the way that you dress up. So I know throughout my classes, I don't have to show up in a certain character, but when it's business time, I put on that suit because I know I have to put that on. So it's like we can engage in this in a way of one, acknowledging that there is a need for this coaching, that there's a need of this development, while also allowing for that freedom of self and choice in how we show up in these spaces. Like even when it comes to when I was in person and teaching, and I get adult ed is a lot different from the traditional four-year college. But even those who were in the dual program, many of them they came from work and they're in class in their work
Yes,
classes,
absolutely.
or they're not employed and they have kids that they're taking care of and they're showing up in their bonnets and
Yeah.
there's no problem, right?
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely.
really, I think the failing here is that the adults in the room are utilizing their power as the adults properly to engage of how this impacts. Like even with the tuition thing, which I agree with, right? Because I've had people walk up to me like, I paid my tuition and I do blah blah blah. I was like, you may have paid your tuition, but you are not gonna your tuition don't pay for you to talk to me any kind of way. Or it honestly, most of them, their tuition don't come towards my paycheck. That grant does. Calm your nerves. But like, different things like that. But like that argument for them is actually developmentally appropriate based off of the societal expectations that they've grown to know. Is
Mhm.
it true? Absolutely not. But I get where they're coming from. But this is a great way to have a conversation with them about what that tuition really pays for. And like you said, there are rules that are in place for the institution. That you're paying all of that, right? And we do have expectations, even when it comes to residence life. And I used to have this conversation with students all the time. Yes, you pay your tuition. Yes, you're paying for the place that you're living in, but there's still some rules that come along with that, meaning you cannot just have any type of items plugged up into your
Right.
wall. You cannot just have any type of items in your room. You cannot just do any and everything that you think that you are should be able to do
Right.
just because you paid for the space. No, there are some active rules of engagement. Like one of our rules is like, hey, if you're going to be in the public spaces, you have to have a shirt on, right? And sometimes that may be a tank top, right? But that's a shirt. And but if you're coming down into the lobby without a shirt, we're going to ask you to go back upstairs, make sure you put something on, and then come back down because this is a shared space and we don't know how your body may interact with somebody else. Do I agree with it? Being was a all male dorm, and but at the same time, hey, that's the rule of the building, and we're going to follow that, right? I'm going to make sure
Exactly.
I'm following that as well, even though sometimes around my house, I enjoy having the titties out and everything, but this is not all me, right? So
Exactly.
it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, no,
mhm,
and that's the thing. When you talked about respectability, that was another kind of conversation I was seeing happening online. And this whole thing about, well, like, well, again, going back to the nature of white culture and race and things like that, where it's like, well, people have, PWIs don't, like, they don't police they, students and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, to be blunt, I can give two shits about what white people do, what white people do, what they are allowed to do and things like that. Because here's the thing, professionalism to me is not a automatically white culture or anything like that. To me, that's a little bit too simplistic. We have
mhm,
our, as black communities, we know we have our long-standing traditions of presentation and ceremony and worship attire and fraternity and sorority dress codes, Sunday clothes, obviously Sunday clothes, right? Everything like that. So it is not to say like white aesthetics are inherently superior. So we as black people must imitate that to become respectable. It's more so saying like, okay, our institution has standards for governing what is appropriate for a classroom, dining, facility, all these kind of other things. And HBCUs should not be required to adopt the most permissive aspects of predominantly white campus culture to prove that, they're liberated or anything like that. And a PWI's unwillingness to form students in a particular way is not automatically what they tend to think of as freedom.
mhm,
So, I just feel like, certain parts of that, are a little bit, skewed. And like, I do like this point that somebody brought up, speaking of like the cultural difference, right? When they talk about, well, white students can, they also wear pajamas to class. And I think that in some ways, that is an important, point because the racial difference is also in how, society interprets it, right? So anyone who is attending like a large PWI has probably seen white students arrive in flannel pajamas, oversized, sweatshirts, slippers, baseball cap, all these kind of things. And that behavior is not necessarily racially exclusive, right? But there is a perception
mhm,
difference. Oh, somebody, a student who's white who's showing up in pajama pants is usually can be viewed as somebody who's, oh, they're just quirky or they're just tired or they're just being a college student. And yes, there is a perception about us. Like if we did something, similar, oh, now all of a sudden we're being deemed as undisciplined, unprepared, all that type of stuff. So that double standard is very much real. But I feel like the solution doesn't have to be eliminating, right, every, like those institutional standards. I think that the solution can be making the rule genuinely universal, and that's where I go into like the language is what I had the problem with when Tuskegee had, put their statement out. So if they had language to say that flannel pajama pants, and again, this is universally, flannel pajama pants should be treated as sleepwear. Bedroom slippers should be treated as bedroom slippers, so on and so forth. And instead, what I had a problem with was this, again, talking about the nature of like the language, as to say, uh, what was it that was said? It's something about uh, something getting into the nature of like the professionalism that was like with the language. That just basically like it was just like too, for me, like the language was just too very much too general um in itself. And yeah, okay, yeah, I found it. I was able to pull it up really quickly. Yeah, this whole thing about just again these general terms, like they don't want anything that is revealing in, or it needs to be like in good taste. It doesn't need to be distracting, and it needs to be appropriate. And when I read that language, I'm like, wait a minute, hold the phone, because those kind of terms are very much subjective, and you need to
Hmm.
have safeguards. So the thing that I do push back at Tuskegee against is that when you were assembling your admin team, I'm probably sure that there were no English majors, or English teachers, communications people who were a part of this team when you decided to implement this, because by saying revealing, distracting, appropriate, so that kind of language can, of course, disproportionately scrutinize women's bodies, right? We
Hmm.
can have that, it invites bias against gender nonconforming or queer students, right? We can have class-based judgments about clothing quality, as we tend to talk about class a lot, right?
Right.
And again, we have uneven treatment when it comes to what we can say as protective hair wear. I'll give a prime example about the bonnets, right? Again, I am not somebody who, but again, that's just me. I do not believe you should be wearing a bonnet to class. However, wearing a bonnet versus wearing a headscarf is entirely different. I had some of my previous colleagues who chimed in on, the nature of this conversation. And, they were also saying the same thing. It's kind of like, if you concerned about your hair when you wake up, guess what? Wear a hat. There are things that you can do that do not require you to have on what again is generally considered sleepwear into these public settings. And even one of my friends brought up the fact of, I remember in our this was like because she was a year ahead of me. Our campus dining hall actually ended up putting out a sign because some people were getting a little bit too laxed in how they were coming, to the cafeteria and the dining space. And, it's just coming from the perspective also. Like, if we have workers who are showing up to, again, provide their service and do their work, it's like, I can't show up in my pajamas, so why should you be able to do it for for yours? And we did have to have some signs that did come out that were, just kind of like letting, reminding students that, hey, you need to have on clothes. You can have on sweats. We wore sweats to class all the time. So again, it's not about you coming to class or you walking around campus every day in, a tie or a business suit or, some sort of formal dress. Yes, we wear sweats, we wear jeans, like you were saying, we wear crop tops, things like that. Again, the main distinction was, again, having certain household items that are more so considered to be sleepwear, wearing them in the nature of the classroom. But again, I did have problems with the nature of the language, and I think that if they would have did a more enforcement kind of ready model, you could have included clear visual examples about what you feel to be is acceptable, casual, academic, and professional, attire versus prohibited sleepwear, right?
Hmm.
You could have had conversations about non-exclusionary consequences. We can have conversations about religious aspects, disability, things like that, to be incorporated into this conversation, rather than you meet, probably more than likely meeting with the admin team. who probably does, dress in business attire, a lot, and just unilaterally almost making these decisions. So I do agree about, again, I agree about, hey, let's actually get back to some standards here. However, do I agree with how the plan was rolled out? No.
Mhm.
So,
And I have to agree, the language that they use is a lot of, misconstrued. It can get very, very bad. And I will even push back and say, like, with the argument with the hair scarf, there are many, and this is just to use women, specifically women who do not use bonnets, but they do sleep in a hair scarf, right? Where that is a category of sleepwear. So now
mhm,
I'm making this argument where, okay, if I could wear a hair scarf, why not a bonnet? If both of these things can be used for sleepwear, as well as the lock caps, those can
mhm,
be something that one may consider a
mhm,
sleepwear, but it's
right,
something that is also protective.
mhm,
So
yeah,
now this is getting into the weeds of, okay, I can do this, but technically that is
right.
bonnet style because it's often silk
Yeah.
laced.
And
So
again,
it's
and again,
like,
and that's where we needed to invite people to have the conversation instead of making the unilateral decision. Because you
mhm,
bring up such a great point. Because especially as a culture of people, we have a lot of things. We have a lot of clothing material that is versatile. I mean, even in my teaching now, I mean, there are some days where I show up completely like casual, things like, no, I don't wear necessarily things that considered to be sleepwear, but I mean, there are some days where I dress down. There are some days where I dress a little bit more business casual. And like yourself, I do not like dressing up. So I've always hated, even from early college days and stuff like that, I've always hated when I've had to kind of dress up in suit and tie and stuff, just because I don't feel comfortable, in
mhm,
suit and tie. And knowing that, hey, it is what it is. But, again, and I do agree that that's where, again, we needed to have other people, primarily, faculty and students, to be a part of this conversation, especially being at a
mhm,
HBCU, because of the fact we do have clothing items that are versatile. So you bring up a very good point about the nature of
mhm,
certain things that can be considered to be sleepwear and also can pass for being casual, can pass for being casual as well. So that's where, again, I think that the institution did a disservice because talking about these items are not just blanket statements.
mhm. Yeah, and my last point, and plus because we run out of time too, but my last point is like with the PWI and bringing them into this, right? Because I went to a PWI, loved it there, but I think what we really need to start challenging ourselves and thinking about, why is it that yes, there are some racial undertones, and
Mhm,
we can always acknowledge and have those conversations too, but we also have to think about it. Why is it that PWI is less restrictive on Black bodies than the HBCU, right? Because these types of rules do impact primarily Black students. And me being a Black student at a PWI, I can show up in the classroom with the bonnet on. I can show up in the classroom in pajamas. I have a little bit more leeway in how I exercise my autonomy that a student at a HBCU cannot. And I see that as being unfair to them, because why are they not deserving of that same right? Because of what, image or how they are portrayed? It's and that's the conversation I believe some people are trying to engage with when they bring up PWI students. It's not the white students. We're
mhm,
talking about how the Black students who occupy these spaces even makes it more normal for our white peers, our non-Black peers, to see Black people engaged in these spaces wearing their bonnets and still being productive students within their community. Because if I see my coworker of, projecting myself as a white person wearing a bonnet in this space, oh, I used to see that in college. This is all good, right? We
mhm.
had conversations about our bonnets in the girls' dormitory, in the girls' res halls, right? I learned about a silk bonnet and started using that for myself, and it's done wonders for my hair. Right?
Yeah.
Like there's a little sense of normalcy that comes along with that. And we shut the door on those conversations if we don't necessarily engage in why is that being brought up, right? And or if we don't think about how this is really impacting Black students at a HBCU versus Black students at a PWI. And
Mm,
I will not accept for Black students in a similar predicament that I may have had, to have more access to their autonomy than Black spaces created for Black people to feel culturally Black at all aspects of their lives,
mm,
right? And I think that's why a lot of people, at least on my end, have see that as an issue. Like even when it comes to some of the structures that Tuskegee is failing at, that they probably should be putting a lot more attention on than what the students wear, like the mold that problem of mold that they're having there. Or even if we throw in other schools like Spelman, their lack of AC for their girls' dorm, like it's 2026. Why haven't we got that fixed? That still frustrates me. But like really thinking about, I want Black bodies at these Black institutions to feel liberated at every single way of their matriculation at this school, because they don't have to even deal with the the conflict of whiteness on a regular basis like those who choose or go to a PWI,
mm,
right? I want them to have a similar experience and more because they're at a HBCU versus what I had to engage at a PWI. Because I didn't have to worry about showing up to class and being told that I have to go back because something that I was wearing.
mm.
I
Yeah.
could walk in and be fully accepted regardless of that. Now, if I didn't do that work, that's when we have a problem.
Yeah. And and I think that, again, because as somebody who has gone to HBCU and PWI, again, I think that the obviously the worlds are completely different. So you just have to, I think at the end of the day, recognize what either norms or standards that you want to abide by and those that you don't. Because again, at the end of the day, you still carry that autonomy. But I'm so glad that you mentioned the thing about having other concerns, because that was also another, like argument I was seeing about, I was seeing like these conversations about why are they worried about bonnets when graduation rates is, not high enough. And
Uh,
to me, I'm like, okay, I get it, but I also kind of, for me, I think it's a little bit of a false dilemma as well. Universities, again, routinely address multiple concerns at once. So I don't believe that Tuskegee in itself has to postpone a decision regarding dress code until it has tackled and solved retention, graduation, housing, financial aid, all these sorts of things. And again, the policy in itself did not arrive completely alone. The Brown administration has connected it to its agenda for internships, industry credentials, attendance, the whole thing with the whole cell phone restriction, professional. And again, this is where this aspect of this conversation is in the professional clothing access and career readiness. And so, yeah, a university, to me, a university doesn't become rigorous merely because a student looks polished. Again, a beautifully dressed student who comes in polished to a T, can still experience poor advising, inadequate housing, all these sorts of things. But I do think that what again has been argued is, this kind of focus on bonnets and pajamas is, overshadowing, student concerns about, other things. And yeah, again, I can see an aspect of that is true. But again, when we're talking about dress code, we're talking about what they believe to be standards. It's not just, to me, it's not just about trying to police the way that you look. It can feel like that. It's I'm not in I have no regard. It can definitely feel like that. But in the retrospect of the real world, where you do have to abide by sometimes dress codes, or even if you are on a job that, is more so casual. Again, there's a certain time and place for everything. You cannot just go, again, like you had even made mention earlier. Like I can't just go into a restaurant in my bathing suit and expect to be served. There's a dress code attire. So at the end of the day, I think no matter where you settle on the fence of this, you obviously at the end of the day can or have the decision to make autonomous choices for yourself. And if the way in which Tuskegee is not aligning with that, you have options, you know
Hmm.
so again, I think it will again be interesting to see how this continues to play out. But what I have considered to be interesting though is the realm in which again, the conversation not just is divisive, but I also think it's also generational as well, because dress codes, appearance, and things like that have, I think become more, like more lax through the years. Because again, when I just, again, personal bias, when I have seen my colleagues and, people who I went to school with and things like that, a lot of people seem to be of, similar or same mindset. It's like, yeah, even when I was juggling three jobs as a college student, I never showed up to class in my sleepwear. I showed up to class, of course, in my work attire,
Hmm.
but never, like my sleepwear. So again, no matter what side of the fence, I think that you're on, it ultimately comes down to like your decision at the end of the day. Is it something that, you can live with? And I think for what Tuskegee is trying to institute thus far, again, I have problems with the language that I definitely think that they should revisit the table of and get some concrete examples to make sure we are not getting into a lot of aspects of discrimination. But for me, I think that what they're trying to do in, the nature of, certain bringing back and it actually enforcing what's actually already in their student handbook about codes of conduct. I think
Hmm.
I have no problem with
Hmm. No, I guess my last words on it is that this does show what they are willing to prioritize.
it.
In terms of the other complaints that the school is facing. Not that they're not doing anything about it, right? But it is showing that the quick fixes, we're going to look at that a little bit more than the things that may require a little bit more long term. But if this is a situation that people who gone to this school 20 years ago are still dealing with today, I feel like we need to be prioritizing the longer experiences more than what a person chooses to wear.
Yeah.
Any last words before close things
Yeah.
out?
No, no, but yeah, I just think it's a very, interesting, kind of topic to, continue, talking about. And it's a great to, I think engage in two different, aspects of, the coin here. So, it's just great to have just great fun debate conversations.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning in to Melanin and Moonlight, your late night space for deep, thought-provoking conversations about sex, culture, and the well-being of the Black community. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep the vibes flowing and your mind open. Bye.
Bye.